Welcome to the Public Works Podcast, where we dive into the systems, people, and ideas shaping the future of American infrastructure. I'm your host, Shane Silsby. Today's episode explores one of the most urgent challenges facing communities across the country: extreme heat. Now, the deadliest climate-related hazard in the United States. As temperatures rise and heat waves intensify, public works departments are on the front lines, responsible not only for infrastructure, but for the community safety and resilience to these events. To help us understand how California is tackling this crisis at a statewide scale, we're joined by two leaders from the Governor's Office of Land Use and Climate Innovation and managers of the Extreme Heat and Community Resilience Program. Those leaders are Dr. Braden and Kelly Meza Prado. Their team oversees one of the nation's most innovative heat resilience grant programs, funding transformational projects that blend public health, infrastructure, and community-driven design elements. In this conversation, we'll unpack the risks of extreme heat, the state's investment strategy, and the values like harm reduction, partnerships, and belonging that are shaping how we approach the resilience work that this program is trying to achieve. Whether you manage streets, utilities, you're in planning, you deliver capital projects, or emergency response, this episode is for you. So let's get started. This is the Public Works Podcast. Welcome back to the Public Works Podcast, where we talk with leaders shaping infrastructure, community resilience, and the future of public works. I'm your host, Shane Silsby, and I'm joined today by a few special guests we'll get to meet here, but we're exploring one of the most important and urgent issues facing our communities, and that is extreme heat and climate mitigation issues, resilience, all those things we'll talk about today. California has taken a bold statewide approach to heat resilience and other climate mitigation efforts. And today, we're honored to have two key leaders behind that effort, Dr. Braden and Kelly Prado from the Governor's Office of Extreme Heat and Community Resilience Program. I know there's other titles you can give to that office, which we can talk about. I want to make sure I get that correct, but at least I know that's one of the programs you're dealing with. So Braden and Kelly, thanks for both being here on the show.
Thank you for having us, Shane.
That's great. Yeah. So we'll get into knowing you all a little bit. A little disclaimer. Braden and I worked in the Phoenix area in Arizona a little bit in the circles there. Obviously, extreme heat an issue there in Arizona. So I was glad when he came over to California to help with that effort here. We appreciate working with him over the years on that. So in getting to know you all, let's start with some background. Can each of you share, and maybe Kelly, we'll start with you, share a little bit about your professional journey, how you came to work on this issue or these issues at the state, and what you're looking forward to next.
Super. Thank you so much. Extreme heat is really a local issue, but the experiences that led to that word for me are actually global. In my previous experience, I did a lot of support for conservation planning in Latin America and other countries in Africa. And I even worked with the World Health Organization for the Climate Change and Health Unit, again, doing more global policy work. And throughout all of those experiences, there were some opportunities to speak with communities in Minnesota, in Latin America, in the Amazons, in the Middle East. And a lot of the conversations that I had with communities were about how are these policy issues that we're tackling having impacts at a local level. So for instance, when I worked in the Amazons is of importance for the global community. We know it as the lungs for the world, but in many communities there still lack access to clean water and sanitation. And so it seemed a paradox to have our most important issues still concentrated in a part of the world where people didn't have access to public health. So because of that and many other conversations like that, I shifted my career to the public side of things. I'm still working in climate change issues, but the way I see it and how I live equity, which is also part of the conversation here, is really working for environmental issues at the global level, like extreme heat is, but really focusing my work on benefits at the ground level. And as we'll talk about that in a little bit, extreme heat, it really is a global issue that many countries are starting to think about. But we need to work in policy and solutions that really are felt at the ground level.
How long have you been working at the state in that program?
Yes, it's been 1 year. And what led me to that, I think many countries or regions have a focus on extreme heat like California does. We have global leaders of science thinking about the topic, but really at the ground level in terms of applicable pragmatic solutions. I think Braden was starting his leadership in California, building the extreme heat and community resilience program. I saw an opportunity to contribute to that global work that I was starting to see in a way that was grounded in local benefits to people.
Great. Thanks, Kelly. A lot of great experience. Probably why Braden is excited to work with you. And Braden, as we move over to your journey, maybe you can explain the office that you all are working on. I want to make sure I have that correct, technically accurate on that. So go ahead, Braden.
Awesome. Yeah. In terms of my career, I'm from Washington, D.C. originally, and just always loved cities and neighborhoods and local action. I started at my D.C. Parks and Rec community garden when I was 5 years old and just developed a deep love of cities and of the infrastructure that cities have, of local food. After college, I was a public school teacher for a few years and then decided that I wanted to get a PhD, and that brought me to the School of Sustainability at Arizona State University, where they were really trying to create the first generation of urban problem solvers. While I was at Arizona State University, I had the opportunity to do a lot of partnerships and work with the city of Phoenix, including the Reinvent Phoenix program, which was looking at how to bring sustainability concepts to the neighborhoods along the newly established light rail. So it was a perfect example of like, how do you take public works infrastructure and then think about housing and green stormwater infrastructure and street trees and urban forestry and all of the things that need to be part of a city. From that, I went and worked at the Office of Sustainability and Resilience in Orlando for a year and was partially in the city manager's office, but partially in public works. So I had the opportunity to be a public works employee, working on urban forestry, working on recycling and waste solutions. Was mentored by Rick Howard, the longtime public works director there. That was a huge mentor of mine. And then moved when the city of Tempe in Arizona, where Arizona State University is, was thinking that they wanted to have a climate and sustainability program, became the founding project manager and then eventually the founding director there in Tempe. And what was so interesting upon getting into Tempe in 2016 is it was right in 2018, 2019, where Maricopa County started to see this spike in the amount of people that were dying from extreme heat. And it was a combination of people being unhoused. It was a combination of people having energy insecurity. It was all of these challenges that really started to put a spotlight on the fact that our region wasn't prepared for extreme heat. And we were seeing infrastructure impacts. We were seeing deaths. We were seeing challenges to running sporting events in March when we were used to having spring training. There were all of these things where all of a sudden this wasn't your grandmother's heat wave. Like the heat was coming earlier in the year. It was staying later in the year. It was being earlier in the day heat was happening. Huge issues with heat staying into the night, never cooling down, getting close to reaching our first night, never going below 100 degrees in the Phoenix region. So we started to see all these tremendous impacts. And then while being in Tempe, I was one of the first folks in the country to put extreme heat as a main chapter in our climate action plan, was one of the first folks to put extreme heat in our emergency management plan that gets sent to the county and then sent to FEMA. And so really because of partners at Arizona State University and interest in the community and a really strong partner with our public works director, with our community services director and other folks in the city, started really figuring out that extreme heat needed to be something that Tempe was really working on. And then we started doing more regional efforts where we were working with other cities like Mesa and Scottsdale and Phoenix and more regionally on how the region needs to approach extreme heat. So After doing that work in Tempe for about 7 years, the opportunity came up. I had been watching what was going on in California, and the governor's office at the time was called the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. It's now called the Governor's Office of Land Use and Climate Innovation. Had a bill to start a new grant program called Extreme Heat and Community Resilience. And that's what brought me here. And now I've gone from having just 2 of us on the team to having an office of 6 amazing professionals, including Kelly, that's leading our grant program efforts.
That's great. It's interesting when we think about California, especially coastal California, where I am, in the houses built without air conditioning. And now that's not adequate enough for the summers we're seeing. People probably think, oh, in Arizona or Phoenix, yes, of course, that's the basics. But your point about every year records were being set, either the most days above 100 or early in the year or late in the year, all those clearly showing that pattern. And then the more that we expand in an area like Phoenix, or think of areas in California that continue to grow, and we add to that urban heat island, you just continue to exacerbate those issues. If you don't start to mitigate it, you end up being in an even worse place. So anyway, I'm not the expert. Let's get back to the experts. So Kelly, let's begin with a little bit of the big picture here. Why is the state of California so concerned about extreme heat? What are some of the public health risks? Why is this such a high priority across the state?
Yeah, such a big question. I'm sure we can spend all day talking about all the stories that we hear as Braden and I having working with many communities across the state. But I just wanted to make sure that we started from a sort of a scientific explanation to what extreme heat is. From a friendly wording of the definition is extreme heat events are days or nights that are hotter compared to historical conditions for a given location. So I'm going to use an example to ground us all, and I'm going to use Sacramento. That's where Braden and I work on a daily basis. Historically, Sacramento on average used to get 20 days above 100 degrees. Now, since the 1950s, which is where we are able to track data a little bit more reliably, in 2024, we broke that record with 40 days above 100. Now, you can think about the situations in places that are southern from us, Thermal, San Diego, LA. They're seeing similar conditions. Now, what I'm using here is a stark example. Sacramento is certainly a very different place. But what I want people to bring home with them is that the days that we are experiencing very high temperatures are increasing as time is increasing as well. And so are the impacts on our daily lives. So you alluded to public health, and we know about heat strokes, but from an epidemiological perspective, we also know that public extreme heat is a triggering factor for heart attacks, asthma, diabetes, kidney failure. And we haven't even started to think or talk more systematically about pregnant mothers and what the consequences may be in newborns. So there is really a broader conversation to be had here. And it's not just an issue of public health, and it's also about the economic impacts of it. Braden talked about bills increasing, and certainly in many places of the state, we can see the energy bills triple during the summer as opposed to, say, the spring months. And so if you are a low-income household, then where does that leave you? You have to either decide between food or turning on your AC. We know that some decisions are being made around those specific trade-offs. I think we're so used to put this in the language of public health, economic loss, but I want to think about, are we losing the places where we live? Are we maintaining livable communities? When we think about children, during extreme heat days, children can't be outside without the risk of being exposed to extreme heat. When our playgrounds being used, our parks and green areas and blue areas being used, are we thinking about those places that we navigate and that they need to work, to play, and just to be who we are in ways that we don't risk overexposure to extreme heat? That's why in California we are worried about that, because as a state, we need to ensure that our state remains a livable community for us. And what we are saying is that extreme heat is an increasing issue for all of us. And for some communities, like low-income communities, that's even a worst case. And that's what we're putting focus on today.
Okay, I appreciate that. We talked a little bit about all those elements, those issues, why the state's concerned. Now, maybe jumping over to you, Braden, that probably led you all or your team to then develop this program, right? The Extreme Heat Community Resilience Program. You can give a little more background on that in addition to what Kelly said, but why should public works professionals think about that now? You mentioned a few of the things earlier in your discussion. Why should they understand? Why should they engage with the initiative?
Yeah, and I love the way that Kelly framed it. And the challenge is because these changes are happening rapidly, and you're seeing communities that were used to 20 days over 100, now at 40, projected to have 60 up to 80 days over 100 degrees. Our communities are rapidly changing. And just to look at California, it's not just going to be in Southern California. All 58 counties are going to see this climate impact. It's not like sea level rise or other impacts that you're only going to see in coastal communities. You're going to see it all over the state, and it's going to look different. Your point about coastal communities is also true for the Sierra Nevada region, is also true for Northern California. Those communities don't have air conditioning. Those communities' infrastructure isn't set up for 5 days over 100 degrees. They've never had it. And we saw with the Pacific Northwest what happens. British Columbia, that town of Layton, 116 degrees. They weren't prepared for it. And the town went up in flames. And so there's all these examples that we've already seen of what extreme heat and the intersection of extreme heat and other threats like wildfire can do for communities. What it really says is like, what is the role of government? What is the role of community organizations in protecting people? Our grant program was created by the legislature to allow for communities to both plan for extreme heat and build infrastructure that'll help make those communities more resilient to extreme heat and try to help both reduce heat illnesses and save lives. We did our first round of funding. We have 45 grantees in 23 counties across the state of California, about 30 planning projects, and the rest implementation projects, about 10 of those physically building infrastructure. A lot of the planning projects are planning for future infrastructure. So we're talking about parks, streets, municipal buildings that could be cooling centers or safe havens for folks. We're talking about all sorts of different ways that communities are thinking about how to produce more shade and keep themselves cool. As this grant program has developed, we've been closely talking to community organizations, to tribes, to climate professionals, to public works professionals. Shane, I've been very grateful to the public works professionals in California you've introduced me to really make sure that this grant program is meeting community needs and that we're building more infrastructure across the state that can help protect Californians. Specifically for public works professionals, when I was at the city of Tempe and the city of Orlando working hand in hand with public works professionals, what I saw over and over again, and Shane, I'm sure your experience is the same here, is that there are just so many times when things that can help protect people and provide more resilience or support community resilience, they get value engineered out of projects. It's not anyone's fault. It's just budgets get tight, costs go up. You can have the best landscape designers, the best civil engineers, you can have the best team assembled, but projects just get cut down and they get cut down. And what gets cut out of those projects? Parks remodels on parks projects, street trees on streetscape projects, additional canopies and different shade structures on buildings, shade structures over parking lots, backup batteries on community centers. The 7 years I was in the city of Tempe, all of these efforts that we had to try to protect Tempeans from extreme heat get value engineered out of projects. Coming to California, the opportunity with this funding that the state has is, and one of the reasons I feel our program exists is to help California understand what happens when you can afford to consider extreme heat. What can happen in terms of helping you make buildings and infrastructure cooler and safer for people so that we have a body of projects where public works professionals were like, you know what? We were able to bring the state money in and protect people. And we didn't have to value engineer it out. Our hope is to gather the evidence and use this as an opportunity to provide projects that are actually protecting people, to make that argument for why we can't value engineer the critical things that really do help protect people. As we're looking for future projects, a lot of the projects we've been considering are when public works directors come to us saying, I've got this parks project, but if I had a little bit of the state money, I'd be able to make sure that I had more street trees, or I had more trees in my park, or I added mottos or hydration stations. We were just in Tulare County, where they're going to be putting shade structures with our grant money over playgrounds, protecting kids, allowing them longer periods of time in the morning to be out using play structures, allowing them to be on play structure in the afternoon when the sun is coming down, really improving their quality of life and potentially their public health outcomes by adding that infrastructure to the park and making sure that doesn't get value engineered out of a parks retrofit project. That's what we hope we're doing. That's the value we hope our program is bringing to public works professionals across the state.
Yeah, interesting. We'll ask Kelly about public health next, but value engineering one way, and I think not even considering those components in the beginning is the other way. Those things get cut before they're even considered, right? Because we hadn't considered those in the past and we're just trying to replicate, it doesn't rise to even being put in the project.
One thing we've noticed, and we've started talking to public works professionals about is, folks that run Parks and Rec, have you talked to your public health counterparts today? Do you know what the public health challenges are in your community? Are you building that into how you're thinking about your infrastructure? Have you talked to your emergency manager today? Have you thought about what they think about and what threats? You do a good job, Shane, of really blending public works and emergency management, but that's the type of conversation. And I respect public works professionals so much. I know you all have a lot on your plate, but the challenge is with climate change, you are at the center of helping protect communities for the decades to come. And critical to you doing that is becoming better friends with some of the other agencies and some of the other professionals that you work with. In all honesty, that's why I hired Kelly. I knew we needed a public health professional helping us shape this program in the same way that I know we need public health professionals in constant conversation with public works professionals in order to try to better solve these problems and protect more people.
Got it. Thank you. Appreciate the passion there. Kelly, Braden is saying, what in the health is going on here? So tell us a little bit about this infrastructure and how it is related to public health in our streets, any opportunities for shade, cooling, water access, things like that. How does that impact the public? We talk about the public health, but how does it impact the health?
Yeah, I love when you say what in the public health. That I'm going to steal that. I can't believe that we haven't come up with something that we're too serious as public health professionals. As you both were talking, I reminded myself I went to a public works lecture at one time, and they said something that I think public health professionals also say. What is it that you do really? What do public health and public work professionals do? And someone that communicated this very clearly in a way that it left an impression on me was that public works was really the physical backbone of our communities. It's all the things that we take for granted that we don't notice until they break. I felt in similar ways how our work in public health is. It's not until something big happens, like an outbreak, right, that we notice what these professionals are actually doing. And I think that with extreme heat and public works, what we're saying here is that extreme heat has the capability of breaking things in public works. Beyond going into the scientific talk about this, I do want people that listen and for us to think about in the summer, are people using bike lanes? If there are no shades, are you choosing to walk the streets that have more tree canopy, or are you really using the streets where you have no access to that? I think that the public health perspective in public works is very much about that. What are people choosing to use? Or how are we choosing to navigate our cities when our health and us wanting to protect ourselves from extreme heat is on the table? We often relate holiday days with going to the pool and going to cool down on the local lake, and that is great. But I also want people to think about the food delivery gig community. I often wonder about how do they face extreme heat days still having to work. They are using very much our public work infrastructure. And I'm sure if there were a cool corridor, they will take that. As pedestrians, are we choosing to walk our streets that we're being funding with money? Are our tree shades actually coming into our decision-making process? Yes, they are. And so I think that there is an important implication for how public works are structured in order to support public health. We can talk about the scientific part of it, but I'm now going to transition into why at a pragmatic level that is not happening. As a state-run program, we can't go into communities and say, you install shade here and you put a drinking water station here. A lot of those decisions are run and made at a local level as they should. This is why our partnership with public works is very important, because there are a lot of those decisions on how cities and our communities are shaped that are made by the local decision makers and very much by public work processes and regulations and codes. If we don't have the partnership from public work offices at a local level, we can, as a state-run program, bring this nexus of public works and public health win-win situations to life. So this is why I think it's important to think about public health and public works. What do we get? But also, at the end of the day, who has the local authority to make these alliances happen is very much something that should be led by public works. We know it happens because we've gone to our streets and we see when it works and we see when it's not. But when it's broken, we realize very quickly.
That's interesting. I define public works as basically everything in the built environment, right? Those are things that the public can use, right? Those are the works of the public. You're saying, Kelly, if you don't consider some of these adaptation elements to impact extreme heat, things like that, people aren't going to use that infrastructure. And then if they don't use that infrastructure, they're not as healthy as they could be, and including to the damage they can get from the heat. So that's interesting. Yeah. So as we talk a little bit about infrastructure and those investments, Braden, your program, as you said, already done some investments in planning and other elements in some early rounds. What are you learning from those investments, or what are the themes that are emerging that you're seeing from your program?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing such a diverse array of the types of infrastructure projects people are interested in. The Coachella Valley Association of Governments is doing a smart surfaces and cool pavement master plan with a pilot project where they're doing a cool pavement pilot project in the parking lot of one of their affordable housing communities. We're seeing microgrid. The electric utility here in Sacramento is working with the local school district to figure out what a solar and battery installation at Hiram Johnson High School would look like, to understand how to bring energy security to a resource like a school. Calveras County is taking their old Civil War armory building and turning that into a solar-powered cooling center. We're seeing Contra Costa County do an urban forestry and shade master plan for unincorporated parts of the county. We're supporting a bunch of different types of school projects also in the LA area, just a wide range of infrastructure projects. And I think from them, we're learning very quickly these projects need time. So a lot of these projects started off saying they would be 18, 24-month projects. Now for this next round, we're basically saying, hey, these are 30-month projects, because the vast majority of them need time. Even if they're coming in with 30% drawing starting our project, they need time. They need time for the design. They need time for community engagement. They need flexibility. So Kelly and I are always working on how we create more flexibility in the work plan as we see plans change and evolve over time. We're learning how to be good grant makers in terms of making sure we're trying to meet the ambition that the communities have, but trying to be flexible where possible, and certainly making sure that the programs have time to take in that community input to really design people-centered infrastructure in the right ways. I think another thing we're really learning is that partnerships between local governments and community-based organizations are critical, because they're, one, bringing more community voice into the projects, understanding where would that hydration station in the park go, or where do you need shade the most, or which building in a community would you actually trust and go to during a heat wave that should have this backup battery power. And then once you've gotten that input, community-based organizations are good at celebrating, hey, we have this thing, now we need the community to use it. We've seen a lot of cool partnerships emerge in this program. The North Coast Opportunities is this really cool nonprofit in Lake County that's working with a local tribe, Middletown Rancheria, and the Lake County and city of Clear Lake to get infrastructure into people's homes. They're doing solar mini splits in 40 of the most heat vulnerable homes in the county. So that's an amazing example of the county couldn't do that alone. The tribe wasn't going to do that alone. They're doing this with this workforce development component, as well as doing the physical projects and making sure that people are trained to do that work so that they can continue to do these types of retrofits, and that they have really strong community engagement to really make sure they're finding the right homes of the most vulnerable people to get these solar mini splits into. So there's really an opportunity to use these partnerships to drive people-centered infrastructure, make sure decisions are being made that work for that community, as well as making sure that community continues to use that infrastructure. One of our other favorite examples in this area is LA County Parks and Rec has partnered with an organization called Climate Resolve. They're doing retrofits in 3 LA County parks. And the pictures that we're getting from the community engagement they're doing is so cool. They're going to the parks. They're asking people what kind of infrastructure they want. They're actually doing Camping 101 training where they're teaching residents how to pitch a tent and how to do all of these resilient. You realize camping is a very self-resilient activity. If you know how to camp, you know how to get yourself food, you know how to get yourself water, you know how to create shade. And so they're bringing that kind of social infrastructure component of learning how to be resilient yourself and knowing all the skills with the physical infrastructure changes of shade and hydration stations and all the things they're doing to make those parts more resilient. So it is really interesting to realize, like, yeah, you can build the infrastructure, but if you don't have that social community piece to it, then people won't know how to use it. It's not necessarily going to become part of that community. So we've seen some really interesting examples of CBOs partnering with local governments, and it's been really exciting to see how people are innovating and how to create infrastructure that really works for people.
Yeah, interesting. And as we move towards funding, because that's what a lot of people want to know about external funding to them. I know, Braden, you and I have talked about your goal was to see if you could integrate your program's elements into a project that's already ongoing so that your funding can go further, right? If you have a shade canopy and it's a standalone project, you have all those overhead costs that go to just put in that shade canopy. But if it's part of a larger project, you can get the benefit there without a lot of those overhead or supporting costs. So Kelly, everybody wants to know about money. So what should we know about the next round of funding? What should public works agencies understand? And is there anything they should be planning for now?
Yes, I am so happy to talk about that because it's always good news when we say there is another round of funding available. We're certainly very honored to be administering that for the state for the second time. In comparison to our round 1, this is round 2, there have been quite a few changes, but I think one that is very relevant to public work offices across the state. Our funding, the priority is for infrastructure for extreme heat. We'll have $22.5 million that will go into those investments. Now we have 2 types of grants that we are funding. The first one is early transformational infrastructure, and the other one is advanced transformational infrastructure. Bear with me with the names because I will dive deep into this. But basically, for the early infrastructure, we really are interested in supporting those communities, partnerships that are early in their development for infrastructure for extreme heat. So the ranges that we're funding for that are anywhere between $600K and $1 million. And the one requirement for that is that has to involve some sort of demonstration project, some sort of infrastructure that it will be used to study the feasibility of something that is bigger. So for instance, if we were testing libraries to work as cooling centers during the extreme heat period, then you will say that you want to test one library during the summer as extreme heat or as a cooling center zone, but plan for the future for a whole county to make sure that their libraries function like that. Whereas the advanced infrastructure is for projects, ideas that are more advanced in their thinking of infrastructure and are ready to deploy that solution. So using my previous example, a whole county might be ready to ensure that all their library network can function as a cooling space during the summer periods. For the advanced infrastructure, we have bigger grants. We are between $2 million and $4 million range. So it's a healthy amount, but as Braden say, infrastructure is very expensive, so it works best when it's a component added to something that is already being on the planning. And just to put emphasis on what Braden had said before, we know that infrastructure for extreme heat has to be trusted by community in order to be used. So a requirement is for these applications to come from partnerships between a public agency and a community-based organization, because we think that bringing the voices of community that are at the front line of extreme heat impacts can really be a good way of bringing that together with the strengths that government has. Otherwise, infrastructure will not happen, or it will not be drafted by the community. And that's so important for us. Now, the last thing I want to say about this before I pass the microphone to Braden is that we'll be releasing official guidelines in April. However, if you go to our website, Extreme Heat and Community Resilience Program, we already have been talking about what round 2 is going to be looking like. There is enough information for partnerships to start thinking about what kind of ideas they have, if this program is a good fit for them. Because one of the main pieces of feedback that we've gotten is that communities want to know way in advance. That is, grants are coming out, so they have time to explore ideas, build partnerships that make sense, and prepare a good application that fits the needs of their communities.
That's great. Thank you, Kelly. So you talked about the funding levels, the rounds, the different program titles and types. And then you talked about guidelines and focus as concepts. Braden, you probably have some more to talk about there in either the guidelines or the concept elements. We hear about things like harm reduction, partnerships, transformation, belonging, things that don't normally show up in a set of construction plans for a public works project. So do you want to talk about those a little bit more and why those are important to the program's mission? And maybe that's how people can start to prepare for this next round.
Yeah, we've been actively struggling with like, how do we work with communities on supporting this future type of infrastructure to help protect us from extreme heat, knowing that we're not used to building infrastructure this way. We're used to being like, a car needs to go on a road, we're building a road. A person needs to go in a park, we're building a park. And getting to this more complex set of infrastructure of like, people need to be shaded in order to stay cool and not have a heat stroke, that involves a lot more sophisticated planning and designing of infrastructure than we're used to. When we did the program the first time, we said we have 10 values that we're trying to get these projects to hit as many of them as you can. And we found that people were really confused about how to make a project hit 10 different objectives. And so when Kelly came in, she did this brilliant job of like, you're allowed 3 and let's get some focus. And so harm reduction at the end of the day is about saving lives and increasing the lifestyle experience of people. How do we create infrastructure that can keep you cool, keep you from getting a heat illness, keep folks from dying out on the streets? How are you telling us that this infrastructure is saving lives or reducing illness? We call it harm reduction in the wonky way, but at the end of the day, how are you helping try to save lives? How are you trying to reduce heat illness? And how is your shade structure or your hydration stations or whatever you're doing reducing harm in your community? That's one key value we're trying to get at. Another key value we're trying to get at that you just heard is partnerships. And at the end of the day, partnerships are about how are you uplifting community voice and working together. And as with these more complex public works projects, you want the business community involved. You want electeds involved. You want community-based organizations and their voices involved. And that's what a lot of the grant programs in the Governor's Office of Land Use and Climate Innovation are finding, is that these partnerships are leading to better projects. And we're certainly championing those types of partnerships, easily understood as how are you working together? How are you bringing all these great assets in your community to the table when you're considering a project? And then This one's been tricky for communities to wrap their heads around, as we've been talking about it this summer, is this idea of transformation. And the basic idea here, and some public works people are like, transformation, what are you talking about? I don't do transformation. And it's like, okay, you can put in a piece of infrastructure and we can pay for it. But the question is, can that infrastructure lead to a lasting policy change in your city or jurisdiction? Can it lead to additional planning around that idea? Can it lead to more infrastructure projects and putting more in your CIP around that issue? And what we're looking at is for our infrastructure investment, not just to be the standalone infrastructure investment, but to have lasting change in your community, whether that's through further CIP investment, policy changes, a new program. So let's say we pay to put in a new forest in one of your parks. Can that then lead to you putting new forests in 5 new parks and have that in your CIP program? Or could you create a new community forestry program that this is the first investment that it's making? Some way of making sure the investment we're making is going to live on in your community, not just through that single project, but through projects that'll continue for years and years to come. At the end of the day, over the next 5 years, we're spending about $100 million on extreme heat when billions need to be spent. And so we're trying to figure out how we work with communities in understanding how does that investment that we're making in your community actually lead to transformational investments and transformational policy for years to come. And the last concept that we're bringing to the table is the concept of belonging. And the idea there is, how can you work with artists and creatives to make sure that infrastructure feels like it's from that place? Public works directors have gotten more used to some of the projects having murals or having some kind of artistic element. And we're looking for all sorts of creative ideas on how to bring community ownership into your project. So we know that those are ideas that aren't talked every day around the public works table, but given the challenges of extreme heat, we feel that these are elements that are going to be really important as we try to build infrastructure that is used by people and really protects people for decades to come.
Yeah, it's interesting because some of these can be abstract or subjective things, but you and your team have been good over the years, or in the past year at least, in helping, as we talk about partnerships here next, back to Kelly, helping people try to answer questions like, is this thing eligible, or is this what you're thinking about? And a lot of that comes through the sessions or forums that you all have been putting on. So I wanted to ask you, Kelly, if you could tell us a little bit more about some of those partnership meetings that might be happening now or upcoming, and what people should know about that. How can they get engaged?
Yes, thank you so much. So partnerships are a requirement for the many reasons that Braden just went over. And as a state, we can't do the matchmaking for transparency sake, but we do have a third-party consultant that is organizing 10 meetings for meets and greets across all the regions of the state. You can look at all the schedule on our website. I believe we have 4 coming up this week. The main goal for these meetings is for people to learn about the partnership requirement in depth, but also really to just say, I am this office, I'm looking for partners. I have this idea about bettering extreme heat issues in this part of California. Is there anyone else out there working or worried about this that wants to become part of the team? Really, that is the environment that we're trying to set for.
Okay, great. Appreciate that. And I'll try to put the website in the show notes. I'm sure we have those floating, so appreciate that. Get involved. So then, Braden, back to you about the benefits of this program, helping people understand that these are somewhat pilots as California looks at some of these approaches. If other states are watching, what should they learn from these investments or innovations that you're leading here in California?
Great question, Shane. And for those of you that aren't from California, thank you for listening. I hope that there's some elements of this conversation that you can take to your state and in your community. I think some of the things that we're noticing, and we're in conversation with states all across the country that are interested in extreme heat, and some of the themes of our program, I think, are themes that other folks are starting to work on. One is prioritizing heat vulnerable communities. How are you thinking about who's most at risk? Is it your population experiencing homelessness? Is it your seniors who are potentially energy burdened? Is it pregnant mothers and young families with children that are heat vulnerable. Who's most heat vulnerable in your community? I think we've been really trying to advance that conversation through our public health department in California, through a new program called Cal Heat Score, that's a new heat warning system. We've really been trying to have an active conversation across the state about how we protect the most vulnerable Californians. And I think that's a very worthwhile conversation that every state should be having. I think our program also does a good job of funding both planning and implementation. We've seen some funding in other states of planning, but almost no state funding implementation. And so we hope that more and more states will fund resilient infrastructure like this. We hope that eventually there's a federal program that funds heat resilient infrastructure, and that the work that we're doing here in California can lead the path of what this kind of funding could look like if, or I should say, when the federal government's ready to take that on. We're also a good example of coordinating statewide efforts. So we're one of the first states to have an extreme heat action plan that brings together our emergency management office, brings together public health, brings together our natural resource agency and our environmental protection agency. So there's a real opportunity to have that kind of multi-agency effort that I hope more states pursue. And then there's the diversity of partners. You heard today about our emphasis on working together in collaboration. I think a lot of states can learn from that in terms of how are you bringing your tribal communities into this conversation? How are you centering the work of community-based organizations and nonprofits? There's a lot of opportunity there. And I think another piece that's so exciting for what we do is that conversation between the state and locals. And so I've started to see, like in New Mexico, Santa Fe and Albuquerque and Las Cruces are having a lot more conversations around extreme heat with the state. The state has now an extreme heat working group. The state of Arizona is the first state in the country to have a chief heat officer who's working very closely with rural communities in Arizona, who's working very closely with the city of Tucson, city of Phoenix, city of Tempe on extreme heat issues. And you're starting to see more of that state local coordination that I think is really important. And we certainly are trying to exhibit here in California. If you think about it, Shane, I don't know if I've said this to you before, when you think about flooding and how our communities protect themselves from flooding, we're sitting on 100 years of flooding policy, flooding regulation. We've had floodplain managers for decades upon decades. There's no heat manager yet. We have 3 chief heat officers in 3 cities, Phoenix, LA, and Miami-Dade County. Had one, Jane Gilbert just retired. We have 1 chief heat officer at the state. The last time in the United States that we had 4 floodplain managers, that was probably like in the 30s, you know.
It's an interesting point you bring up, because as you have all the floodplain managers and flooding is intensifying and the durations are getting longer and all that stuff, but we can adjust the models from a system that's already in place. You're saying we don't have that system in place yet. So I like what you talked about a nationwide reach for this. People like to beat up on California, but maybe take advantage of what California is doing in this case. I have experience in Michigan, where I grew up. Increased heat is affecting crops. It's affecting hunting cycles. In Arizona, where we both were at, it's affecting sports, as you said, things like that, air conditioning bills. It is a nationwide issue. I had a colleague of mine in Alaska that was talking about changes to the insect populations and even fishing because of heat changing. Yeah, it's a nationwide issue. We've covered a lot there. There's a lot going on. Kelly's an expert. Braden's an expert. We're hoping that you all will become many experts as you listen to this and go to the community workshops. But is there anything else we missed, team? And then where can our listeners hear more about the program and upcoming opportunities?
Yes, so we have a grant, we have money, but other offices also have money that we think could fund or be compelled to fund extreme heat projects. 2 of them are our sibling grant programs. They are the Transformative Climate Communities and the Community Resilience Program. Both are administered by SGC, the Strategic Growth Council. Their guidelines are coming live on April as well, but their draft is already listed on their website. I will say anyone that's interested in grants to wait for the extreme heat program, but also there are other ones that we can still be looking for extreme heat connections and funding for that purpose. And the last thing I will say is perhaps to keep everyone thinking about public works and the function that extreme heat can have on them. The next time that you go to wait for the local bus, look up, do you have a bus shelter over you? Will you be waiting for the local bus on a day of 100 degrees? Will that bus shelter, if they have a bus shelter, be powerful enough to shield you from that? And if you are like, absolutely no, I want to drive, then ask yourself, who will be forced to have to wait for that public transportation mechanism to get where they need to get?
Interesting. Braden, anything else we should touch on here as we wrap up?
Yeah, one of the other things that we didn't talk about as much as where is this money coming from? The first batch of money that we had came from this generational investment of $50 billion that the state of California had additional money because of tax revenue, decided to spend it on climate. A small chunk of that money ended up coming into starting our grant program. Since then, we've had cap and trade dollars that California has one of the only cap and trade systems in the US. And this next grant round is partially funded by our cap and trade program that taxes fossil fuels. We're also funded, as Kelly just mentioned, with several other projects by the California Climate Bond. The California voters voted on a $10 billion bond last November to fund climate infrastructure. And so we have another $50 million in that. Californians have decided we need this climate infrastructure and we're going to basically tax ourselves for it. And then we actually have another round of funding that is a settlement from a gas leak in Southern California, where we are going to be administering our program in 8 affected communities in LA that have been affected by this gas leak, but are also affected by extreme heat. And the reason that I am mentioning these sources of funding is as local governments, as state governments, as the federal government are thinking about if we do need transformation of our public works infrastructure to handle extreme heat, where is that money coming from? And the fact of the matter is it needs to come from local taxes, regional taxes. It needs to come from bond money. It needs to come potentially from fossil fuel settlement money. And so as we do this work for the coming decades, we need to get really creative how we're developing these technologies. We need more advancement in HVAC technology. We need more advancement in cool roof and cool surfaces material. We need more advancement in shade structures and shade sails. There's so much technology innovation that's needed, and that's not going to happen alone. At some point, the federal government, in my mind, needs to have something like the CHIPS Act that was for microchip manufacturing, but is for cooling technologies. And we have to have this kind of transformational investment in the workforce and in the technologies we're using. And we have to fund public works departments across the country to do it. And so that's no small task. I think Kelly and I, as we've talked about, we're honored to be at the tip of the spear of this extreme heat effort. We're honored to work with all of these communities, tribes, community-based organizations, public works departments across the state of California. And I'm hoping in a few years we can come back and get to brag about all this amazing work that folks have done across the state.
Oh, that's great. I don't know the exact saying, but the journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step, right? So you all are taking the first steps to eventually get this grand journey underway. With that, I could talk to you all day, all week. There's so many things we could jump into, but Braden and Kelly, I want to thank you both for sharing your insight and leadership today. Extreme heat is one of the most significant climate challenges of our time. As we said, nationwide issue. Your work is shaping how communities can stay safe, resilient, and connected through some cool corridors or just being able to wait for that bus. And to all the public works professionals listening, remember, infrastructure does contribute directly to public health. And your work can save lives, especially as heat intensifies across the country. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of the Public Works Podcast. Be sure to subscribe, leave a review, share this episode with colleagues who care about the future of infrastructure across the country. And with that, we'll see you next time. Thanks.
That's a wrap for today's episode of the Public Works Podcast. A special thank you to Dr. Braden Kay and Kelly Meza Prado for sharing their insights and for the important work that they're leading across California. Their efforts remind us that infrastructure is public health, and the decisions we make today will shape the resilience of our communities for decades to come. If you found today's conversation valuable, please take a moment to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with your colleagues in public works planning and community leadership positions. Your engagement helps us grow the the conversation around innovation, resilience, and the future of infrastructure. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel and follow us on LinkedIn. Thanks for listening, and as always, keep building, keep improving, and keep supporting those that are serving your communities. Thank you very much.